It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Bryson. She is the translator of John Henry Newman, A Life Sacrificed by Ida Friederike Görres, Ignatius 2024, and other works by Ida Görres. At present, she is translating additional works by Görres and researching Görres, Augustin Rüssler, and Oda Schneider. She is a fellow in the Catholic Women's Forum at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and she currently resides in Lincoln, Nebraska. Welcome to NINS. Welcome to Pittsburgh. We're so grateful to have you here. So the purpose of today's conversation is really just that. It's a conversation. Really, I want to hear about your work. So so I have a few questions that I'll ask, and really, I will turn it over to you to just tell me about your work. So,
and it's also a privilege for me to get to talk about the work of Ida Görres on Newman with Newman specialists, because I'm not entirely in the Newman world, and so it's a really wonderful interface, because I'll be excited to hear what those more familiar with the work on Newman and Newman himself have experienced from this book.
Absolutely. Well, first off, tell me a little bit about who Ida Friederike Görres is. So who was she, and how were you introduced to her writings?
So I think the first thing is that she's largely unknown today. She was born in 1901 in Bohemia. I got to visit her home, the home estate of her family. Her maiden name was von Coudenhove-Kalergi. Okay. And it's in a little village today in Czechia. Okay. And her father was a diplomat in the Habsburg Empire. He had been all over. He was in Brazil and Turkey. And at the time he was stationed in Tokyo, Japan, he met a young Japanese woman whom he married, who then was the mother of Ida Görres. So she was half Japanese, half Austrian. And her father and her mother, after they had had their first two sons in Japan, moved back to the home, the family estate in Bohemia, where she was born. She grew up there, and her father died when she was very young. And this is one of the significant aspects of that for this book, and for her interaction with Newman being a figure of the 19th century, is that she was in a remote area, is that his library, because he died, I think, around 1906, didn't develop after that. So it was very 19th century focused. Right. And so she grew up using her father's library. And she was a very curious young girl from early on. After that, she went to Catholic boarding schools, first near Vienna and then in St. Pölten. And in St. Pölten, at a Catholic boarding school run by the Mary Ward sisters, was where she experienced being loved. She had a very difficult childhood before that. And as a teenager, she had an experience. She had been baptized 2 days after she was born and raised Catholic, but that experience as a teenager was really the turning point in her life. And that lit her faith on fire. And from then on, her entire life was devoted to the church. After high school, she spent 2 years in the novitiate of the Mary Ward sisters, but then determined that wasn't her calling. And then she went on to various university studies, but didn't entirely finish her work. She studied in Vienna and then in Freiburg. In the 1920s, the second most significant turning point in her life is the Catholic youth movement. This tremendous Catholic revival going on in Germany. And she was deeply involved. She wrote for several of the journals. She was a leader in girls and women's ministry. And she was in the section of the Catholic youth movement in Quickborn under Romano Guardini. Wow. And that really was her life. She lived for a while, so was a consecrated virgin, and then was worked in the Diocese of Meissen, in charge of ministry for girls and women. And it was at that time that she met the man who would become her husband, Karl Joseph Görres. And they married in Leipzig at the Oratory.
Oh, okay.
The foundation of the oratories in Germany was very connected to the Catholic youth movement. So she was very close to the Oratorian fathers.
Okay.
And she and her husband were sadly unable to have children. And she writes about this in deeply moving ways, that their experience with infertility was the greatest pain of her entire life. But that is relevant to her writing because her vocation then became being a wife and then also a Catholic writer. And she spent her life writing, and she's most known for hagiography.
Okay. Wonderful. So you already mentioned Romano Bordini, who is a huge name in Catholic theology. One thing I found really interesting in researching her, preparing for this conversation, was that Joseph Ratzinger, who would become Pope Benedict XVI, eulogized her. So she rubbed elbows with some really important figures in the Catholic Church. In his eulogy for Ida Friederike Görres, Joseph Ratzinger calls her, quote, a voice which seems irreplaceable to the church in this situation. When we are a desert of conformism or embarrassed silence. Continuing, he says, quote, she spoke with an insightful certainty and a fearlessness about the pressing questions and tasks of the church today, something which is given only to the one who truly believes, end quote. Can you speak a little bit about her relationship with Ratzinger, and why and how she can still be considered a compelling writer for those of us today?
She found out about then Father Joseph Ratzinger, it seems around, she may have heard of him by the late 50s, but then by the early 60s, especially as things started to get really crazy in Germany.
What do you mean by really crazy in Germany?
She, having come out of the Catholic youth movement, she was aware that there were many different currents within the church in Germany. But she experienced by the early 60s that all of a sudden what she felt was quite a radical progressivist wing began to push forward.
Okay.
And it was at that time that she was incredibly happy and grateful and excited to discover Joseph Ratzinger. And she wrote in a letter to Father Paulus Gordon, a Benedictine with whom she corresponded. And fortunately, her many letters to him in the 60s up to her death in 71 have been published and are an incredible witness to that era of the church in Germany.
Yeah.
She wrote to Father Gordon, I found my prophet in Israel. And she said that was Ratzinger.
Okay.
And so she began corresponding with him. She also published an article. She was sometimes critical of his work, not in a combative way, but in just engaging Catholic intellectuals, engaging on church questions.
Sure.
And they then met after that and continued corresponding. So one of my projects on the horizon is I have found out where his letters to her are, and I'm hoping that her letters to him are in the Ratzinger archive in Regensburg. And I would like to, if I can get permission, to edit and publish those.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah, keep me posted on that.
She corresponded with other contemporaries. There's also letters between her and Hans-Urs von Balthasar.
Really?
Her letters to him are in an archive in Switzerland, and I found his to hers. I don't have time to do those, and it would need somebody who knows the world around von Balthasar well.
Okay.
So if anybody's listening, looking for a scholarly project.
I know a few people I will ask.
Great.
That sounds really interesting. So how would you describe Görres's vision of the Catholic Church?
Well, and her vision of the Catholic Church relates to why she's so relevant today. She always had a tremendous love for history, church history, and she was very knowledgeable about church history. So she has this huge view of the church. In her book, The Church in the Flesh, she describes the church as bedrock and tree. That's the title of one of the chapters, is Bedrock and Tree. And I wanted to translate the chapter as rock and tree because it sounded better. But the German term she's using is not referring to like a rock that I could pick up and move. She's referring to like a cliff, really a stone foundation on top of which you build something.
Okay.
So she has this deep sense of unmovable solidity and living dynamism. And one of the things I love in her work that I think is valuable today is she's so comfortable with both. Whereas some want to go towards just the bedrock, and some want the tree even without its roots, which isn't sustainable.
Right.
Whereas she thinks that the relationship between the tree and the bedrock is entirely indispensable. So she has this really interesting balanced, I think, view.
That's a really beautiful analogy, actually. And that moves us really well, segues into Newman, because Newman has a very similar, well, not similar, but he has the same idea of the church as historically there's an unmovable foundation in church tradition and dogma in particular. But there's also this idea of, his famous quote of everything changes to, butchering it, but everything changes in order to remain the same, right? And so within his theory of development is this idea of the concrete, but then, the movable. So I know you had already mentioned that Newman was probably in Görres's father's library, but how did her interest in Newman develop? How did it come to be?
So I actually suspect it's likely that Newman was not in her father's library, but he had a lot of 19th century thinkers.
Okay.
And that's significant because as I started to read Görres and begin to translate her, I found myself constantly looking up 19th century thinkers, getting to know them, getting to know the 19th century better. And I was wondering, like, why is she so knowledgeable of the 19th century? And I think it's because of his library. Her father was Catholic, but he was part of this aristocratic segment that was also very liberal in a classical European sense of liberal, and thought we should certainly be Catholic. He defended the Catholics against a movement at the time to try to convert German Catholics to Protestantism in order to strengthen German nationalism. It was called the Los von Rom Bewegung, away from Rome movement. So he wrote a book critical of that movement, but he was very liberal, and her older brothers were totally secular and anti-church and liberal. So it was likely that she discovered Newman later.
Oh, okay.
And one of the journals that was central to the Catholic youth movement is called Hochland. And while it was founded at the very beginning of the 20th century, one of the things I learned, Klaus Arnold has a very good article offering an overview of the reception of Newman into German, is that Hochland began writing on Newman already in like 1907 or so. An author named Lady Charlotte Blennerhassett wrote a biography of Newman. I've forgotten. I want to say that was like 1908, maybe. And Görres quotes that in her book. So I was able to get a copy of it to check some of the quotes. so Newman is already present, so in the area around her. But then by the 1920s, some of the figures in the Catholic youth movement are also among those who are starting to translate Newman, talk about Newman. And while I haven't been able to trace where the connection starts, I think it's really likely that it was in the 1920s during the Catholic youth movement.
Okay, interesting.
And one other element of Görres is she had her nanny growing up was English.
Okay.
Because I'd been trying to figure out how she knew English so well. For example, she translated some works by Lewis from English to German.
Oh, wow.
And I was able to figure out, doing my translation of her book on Newman, that in some passages she was doing the translations from English to German, even on works where there were established published translations into German of that work.
Oh, okay.
So the fact that Newman was starting to become influential, and also that she knew English so well, and she loved England. She said if she ever had a second home, it would not be Japan, it would be England. And she wrote her thesis in the history department in Freiburg in the 1920s on King Edward, I think it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So in A Life Sacrificed, which is Gooders's book, she refers to Newman as, quote, church father of the 20th century, explicitly the 20th, that is, a lighthouse in the rotation of the stars, strangely having two faces. One is the familiar one that is already fading. The other is only beginning to reveal itself and to shine like a rising star in our great darkness, end quote. Similarly, she writes of Newman as, quote, a morning star, not the evening star of the cherished but sinking culture, humanism, etc. Rather, the morning star of a free, lonely, believing spirituality. Can you explain this imagery here, and say a little bit about what is unique about her reading of Newman?
Many looked to Newman in his 19th century context, which is, of course, where one has to start.
Mhm.
That was his life. Those are the influences that he's responding to. But she saw his greatest significance as being not in the 19th century, but as a Catholic thinker and man of faith who saw the profound changes coming in the modern world in Europe, incredible differences in worldview, and somebody who was laying the foundations for Catholics for figuring out how to navigate that in the 20th century, and I would add the 21st.
Okay.
That's how I understand her image of, she looks to him not as the setting star of the end of the 19th century, but as somebody whose light began to really shine and rise in the 20th.
Okay.
Another aspect of that has to do with the title, A Life Sacrificed, is she has a somewhat unusual reading of the spiritual meaning of his life, in how many times during his life he was poised as just had incredible capabilities, natural capabilities, and was so a heart that was so committed and hardworking. He could have been a star in any field, and it looked like he could just rise and be this great star and fix things in the Catholic Church that people wanted fixed. And again he kept hitting brick walls. And she, through reading as many letters as she could get a hold of, and other primary sources and secondary sources about Newman's life and those who were close to him, she saw in him somebody who was able to sacrifice for the greater good of the church. And thus this inability to realize some of the visions that he had in the 19th century, instead of viewing that only as loss, she saw him as being willing to just accept providence, but that the intellectual way he was working through what it means to be Catholic under these difficult and changing circumstances was what sets up the 20th century. And she wrote this book, even though she didn't publish it during her lifetime. She wrote almost all of it around 1946 to 48. So she's just come out of World War II.
Right.
The Germans are trying to figure out how to go forward. The Catholics in Germany are, questioning deeply about what is it going to mean to go forward. And it's at this point also that some of the, let's just throw it all away and start over progressivists, to, summarize more than is just, but
Sure.
to fit it in a nutshell, voices were starting to arise. I think she saw Newman as the Catholic who lived in the here and now and saw the world changing and realized we needed to understand these changes going on and respond, and had a sense of the bedrock side of the church that was the foundation that made it possible for the tree to be living and growing. And so
yeah I'm going to look more into those imagery. You mentioned that she is known for her hagiography. And one of the beautiful things about hagiography is you get these images, often kind of an earthy, just different way to look at saints. And Saint Newman now. So that's definitely something I'm going to reflect on in the near future.
And she, in her book, she saw him, and this was the late 40s, as somebody she thought would someday be raised to the altars. And she calls him Church Father of the 20th century.
Oh, wow.
So.
Yeah, I'm going to adopt that. I like that. So Ida Friederike Görres lived in Austria and Germany, and you've already kind of alluded to this a little bit and talked a little bit about it. She lived during both of the world wars. Can you speak to how these wars influenced her theology and writing, and in particular her reading of Newman?
During the First World War, she was a young girl, and she was in boarding school at that time. I have the distant impression, and I hope that we can find more about her life, that she was largely removed from a lot happening in the First World War.
Okay.
Although there are dramatic changes, dramatic losses happening around her that she's then emerging into as she finishes high school. And it was also the horrors of the First World War that I think played a role, along with many other factors, in the Catholic revival in the 1920s of, that is not the way. As we go into World War II, one of the things that's I think it might be in her obituary. It's in something that Erich von Kuhlner-Ledin, who was a well-known Catholic writer in the 20th century and a good friend of hers, he wrote about how intensely her husband hated the Nazis from very early on. And the Catholic youth movement milieu was very associated with resistance to the Nazis. For example, the journal Hochland played a very important role in the Catholic intellectual resistance to the Nazis until the journal was completely shut down and banned by the Nazis.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's the realm within she's circulating. In terms of her life, she married in 34 or 35. So just at the beginning of this. And she took her vocation as a wife very seriously. And so also at that point, she's got this huge life shift and begins to focus also on home life and the difficulties that her husband then has with finding work, and they have to move. And it's also a time that World War II, that she withdraws somewhat. That's the time that she does the research and writes what's considered her magnum opus, her book on Saint Therese of Lisieux,
Oh,
which she first publishes in 1944. The warehouse where the first print run is firebombed and lost.
oh my goodness.
But the book is then republished in 1946.
Okay.
Also, during World War II, she wrote and edited 3 volumes of works for girls and young ladies.
Okay.
And this was an impact that the war had on her intellectual life, and that changed the direction somewhat, because she was very concerned already in the 20s with ways that modernism posed a threat to a Catholic wholesome view of girls and women.
And when you speak of modernism, do you mean what do you mean by
Let me rephrase that as secular modern currents of thought.
Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
So, for example, later on in the 60s, she wrote an article arguing against the ordination of women.
Okay.
And in the opening of that, she mentions that in the late 1920s, she heard about a group that went from Berlin, I think from the university, to Rome to advocate for the ordination of women.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, at the time, we thought it was a great joke. But she starts to realize that there's some very, very different views of man and woman. And she also writes throughout her lifetime a great deal about marriage and very wholesome relations between men and women.
Mm-hmm.
So she's aware that discussions around those issues are changing dramatically. And she felt that the Nazi view of women was a very, very, very deep threat.
What was the Nazi? I don't know.
So one thing I'll admit is I'm still, it's on my to-do list to go through her 3 volumes that she wrote at this time for
okay.
girls and women.
Gotcha.
And she edited them. She also collected works by other authors that she felt presented a wholesome Catholic view against the Nazi view.
Okay.
And she also writes about how that view changed based on what the Nazis needed. That at first the Nazis say, oh, you could just like stay home and take care of the families. And then, when we become useful laborers in the, factories in the war. Mm-hmm. I still have more to learn about that.
Okay.
But a part of her concern, among many other aspects, this was one of them. And so these 3 volumes that she published one of the things she did a lot with were short stories.
Oh, interesting.
And it's one of the ways I think she got past the censors, is it just looked like cute stories for girls. But the stories that she collects are by all these really great authors that are really actually have these sophisticated narratives and role models and symbols. So,
do you think those will appear in English?
And if God grants me a long life and funding to do this work, I have an eye on those, but I won't be able to get to them soon.
Okay.
Although I have translated one short story by her that I'm hoping to publish in an edited volume that was published in German by great Catholic fiction writer, German language fiction writers of the 20th century.
Okay.
So I'm hoping to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So that somewhat of the influence of the wars on her life, and I think that her turning to Newman in the early years right after World War II is directly related to the horrors that she experienced in World War II, and realizing Catholics needed deep roots. Again, she's always looking to deep, long-term roots in the church, but they needed somebody who was just really a sharp, deep, astute observer of the changing world in Europe. And she saw that in Newman. Mm-hmm. And she's not the only one who saw that. There were these quite sophisticated adult education programs developed in Germany. The ones I know of are from like 1946 to 49 as a response to World War II. And the lack of catechesis and the disorientation of the population. And lectures on Newman played a really important role in those adult education programs. I found the program, the schedule for one from 1949, and Ida Görres is giving a lecture on Newman at that.
Oh, wow.
And the siblings of the Scholl siblings that were martyred
Yeah.
during the White Rose movement, some of their siblings were then involved in founding these adult education programs from 46 to 49.
Okay.
And in multiple examples of those, Newman shows up. Another example of how important Newman was right after World War II, which was something I didn't know until I started working on this book by Görres, is that in 1945, at the anniversary of Newman's conversion, a friend told me that in England, maybe you know more about this, they decided not to hold a big event because it was right after the war and things were just too chaotic.
Yeah.
Whereas in Cologne, Germany, literally in the rubble, the German Catholics were so committed to and excited about Newman that they had a big event in the fall of 1945 for the anniversary of Newman's conversion.
Huh. I did not know that.
Yeah. So that's the context in which
Yeah.
she also then starts giving lectures on Newman. And the book, the chapters and sections consist in part, according to Dr. Hannah-Barbara Gerl-Falkowitz, who edited the German edition. You know, it appears that some of these, based on like notes she had about dates and locations, she was preparing lectures on various aspects of Newman's life, but but then they fit together because part one of the book, chapters 1 through 8, is a life of Newman, but it's not a strict academic biography.
Right.
It's a hagiography in I think the best sense of the word hagiography. And it's also her trying to understand. So her book on Saint Therese of Lisieux is called The Hidden Face, because she'd seen a picture of Saint Therese of Lisieux that was very edited to create a certain image of sort of cute charm. And Ida Görres later on found an image of Saint Therese of Lisieux that had been unedited. And she said that face just spoke to her so deeply. So her book is called The Hidden Face, to try to get behind the public image that's created, to wonder who is Saint Therese of Lisieux. Well, Dr. Gerl-Falkowitz calls this book The Hidden Heart of Newman, which I thought was great, because I think that Ida Görres is trying to get into who was this man. So that's chapters 1 through 8 of the book. And then chapter 9 has 2 poems that Newman wrote. And to me, a tip I would give to readers is, in my experience, those 2 were the keys to me that helped me understand what Görres is doing in chapters 1 through 8 with Newman's life. She chose those 2 poems very specifically, not just because they happen to be nice spiritual poems by Newman.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And then chapter 10 is basically a standalone, much longer monograph on conscience. And what's distinctive about Görres's work there is she draws very heavily on his sermons, not only on his writings about conscience.
Right. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff on conscience, and the parochial and plain sermons in particular. Yeah, if you're going to look at Newman on conscience, I would say always, start with the sermons and then work your way up to the grammar of assent, which a lot of people want to start with the grammar and then kind of think that the sermons are kind of cutesy, but really the sermons hold up the grammar in a lot of ways. So in 1932, Christopher Dawson and T.F. Burns included her short book, excuse me, In the Nature of Sanctity, in volume 1 of their stories, The Persistence of Order. What was the relationship of Görres to the English Catholic publishers?
She had very close relationships with them, and I'm hoping someday I can find some of the correspondence behind this from the early 1930s, because she published On the Nature of Sanctity, which is a dialogue between two fictional characters about Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. But the topic, she's using the life of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, was one of her favorite saints, to look at what is sanctity. And it was, so she's clearly known to the English speaking Catholics, because right away, within a year of that book being published in German, it's already translated into English, published as a standalone, as a short book by Sheldon Ward, first in the UK, later on in the US. And then Christopher Dawson and T.F. Burns included in their series, The Persistence of Order, in volume 1. And her other works in the 1930s, such as one called The Burden of Belief, which is again a dialogue between two fictional characters about what it's going to mean to be a believer in a non-believing world. Again, she, like Newman, is seeing the world changing. We've got to figure this out. That was picked up right away, translated into English, published by Sheldon Ward. And she also in the 1930s wrote letters. They were, I would say, epistolary essays. This is a very common genre in Görres's work. These weren't, letters that she had posted and written to someone and published later, but she's writing. She wants to engage the author in a way, or the audience in a way the audience understands they're being heard and being listened to. And it's letters to young women on vocation. And that includes also an essay by St. Joan of Arc. So that's published by Sheldon Ward. And in Frank Sheed's book, Saints Are Not Sad, published later in the 1940s, it's an anthology of essays by different authors on the saints. He includes her essay on St. Joan of Arc.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I think I've run into that. Yeah.
And then in 1939, Longmans, Green and Company published an English translation of her book on Mary Ward.
Okay.
Which is sort of a novel, biographical novel. So she definitely had close relations, but for her, as for other authors, that's interrupted in World War II.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting that she had such I guess we can say, a devotion to Therese of Lisieux and Elizabeth of Hungary. I'm thinking, I can see it on my shelf. The Hans Urs von Balthasar volume on the saints features heavily with Therese of Lisieux and Elizabeth of Hungary. And there's one other saint that is escaping me at the moment. But it's interesting to see the same female saints really coming up in these, very influential theologians.
Yes, and I don't know how Hans Urs von Balthasar became interested in those. And they were, important in the, early mid-20th century. Sure. But also Hans Urs von Balthasar was somewhat critical of her book on Therese of Lisieux.
Was he? Okay.
And so then he's like, I'm going to write my own. I've heard. That's what I've heard. And then somebody I know who knows both books very well said, and then he ended up saying like sort of what she said. But there's also an article she wrote on Therese of Lisieux later that is a response to those who were critical of some aspects of her book. So I'd like to translate that someday. Yeah. So this relationship between Görres and von Balthasar and Saint Therese of Lisieux comes in there.
Oh, that's fascinating. Fascinating. So let's move a little bit to kind of the nitty-gritty of translation. So translating a text from German to English that is based on an English-speaking author can be kind of tricky. Can you speak a little bit about how you address the English Newman texts? Did you translate them back into English, or did you find them? This is kind of a selfish question, because I see this in French all the time, where translators will not realize that it's a Newman text and then not find it, but retranslate it, and then you get some kind of garbled. So translation in and of itself is a problem in and of itself. So did you find any instances of Görres perhaps taking liberties with her translation of Newman? So just talk a little bit freely about the translations.
So one of the things that was a blessing in disguise is that I had no idea how hard this project would be. I honestly think I would not have started. And I honestly can say I'm really grateful I didn't know that. Even though I suffered and struggled and spent far more time than I had thought I would need to, I am really grateful that this book is available today to English readers.
I'm grateful too.
So if it had been a scholarly work that had been done slowly for an academic audience and it was in German, completely footnoted, even then all of the Newman quotes, because I knew I had to give the reader Newman in Newman's voice. I couldn't do what's called a back translation of somebody translates Newman from English to German, and then Jennifer in the 21st century then translates, and there's multiple translators of Newman into German, so you may have many different ways of looking at Newman in the book. Then I would translate that later German into my 21st century Jennifer's voice English. By this point we're getting multiple steps removed, and this is Newman.
Right.
I respect him, but also his command of English is just so gorgeous. So I knew from the start I was going to have to find the Newman quotes. Now, Görres's heart of her writing, her whole life, was to write for the laity, we might say the educated laity, at least moderately educated, not necessarily not academic, to move their hearts from faith as a cultural habit, identity, to individual faith on fire in relationship with God and Christ. That was her passion her whole life. Thus, and also this book, as I mentioned, she didn't publish in her lifetime, so she didn't finish it, such as putting in footnotes. And she was giving lectures on Newman, not writing, even though she was writing down the lectures. Which means that most of the quotes have no citations.
Oh boy.
At all. Now, Dr. Gail Falkowitz, who got this book in the late 90s when the manuscript popped up, and you can read about that at your
a Newman Review article, actually.
Yeah. She did a great job, to the extent she could, trying to find sources. So that added some more footnotes, but over 50% of the Newman quotes in the German edition don't have citations. So I created this whole spreadsheet of every single Newman quote in German. And then thanks to a terrific intern from St. Thomas in Minnesota, we went through and hunted, and I would give him my estimated translation. And he knew, we talked about this a few times in depth, that the English text he's seeing is not the text he's looking for.
Right.
He's seeing my estimate. And I could not have done this. And I'm not saying this because I'm at NINS. I could not have done this without the website of the National Institute of Newman Studies. Your donors, the pioneers who helped to make that website available, it would not have been possible, because it was thanks to having the collected works of Newman available online for word searches that I used. I didn't use other websites. I used those constantly, but it was really, really hard. Let me give you an example of some of the crazy hard it was. And this is an example from another book called What Binds Marriage Forever that's coming out from CUA Press this fall, from Görres. She has a comment in there about, now I'm going to, paraphrase from the 20th century German, about a ship being moored, or a ship being tied to the pier, I think it was, with a rope, something like that. And it's a phrase. She doesn't even have a whole sentence. So when there are long quotations from sermons, I loved those because it gave me so many different keywords and phrases that I could look for. But if it's just a phrase she's quoting, it's hard. And so I searched for that one for months and months. And it ended up being, so for example, instead of the German word was Schiff, but the English word is vessel. It didn't think to search for vessel.
Yeah.
And then it was a thread, moored by a thread. So it was sort of like a reverse engineering guessing. But I, in the end, found about 98% of the quotes. So the book has many, many footnotes. And sometimes I used, in the library where I was working in Austria, I had the German translations of Newman. So I could look up particular quotes in context in the German translation to make sure I was going to the right passage in the English translation. So the reader's getting real Newman, but it was very, very challenging. Although for me, it was also a chance to start to get to know Newman's sermons better. Although my first chance for that was in a NINS reading group that you led, and I loved that, slowing down and looking at one or two sermons at a time. But then this book helped me really get more into sermons.
Yeah, absolutely. The thought has escaped me. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's fascinating. The idea of, or the process of translating is a field in and of itself. It's not, I know, I've translated a little bit from French to English, and historical texts, not only it's never just French. So, and I would argue that I don't, it's, you have to know the person, you have to know the worldview, you have to know the idioms,
The era.
the historical context. I mean, there's just so many things that go into a translation. I'm always fascinated by the process.
And I had hints of how Görres was working in the book. So, for example, in her handwritten notes, she has a lot of quotes from Ward's Life of Newman.
Okay.
And so, and also in a certain chapter, I would start to realize, okay, I can tell which books she's using while she's working on this. I'll look in those first. And sometimes that worked.
Yeah, and Ward's, this is actually Ward's biography. You're talking about Wilfred Ward's biography of Newman. That's available on our Newman Reader and probably our digital collections as well. It is available in our digital collections.
I used the Newman Reader because there was one version of each text. The digital collections, it's an amazing resource, but if I pulled up a work, there were so many different versions of it that came up that I was overwhelmed. But in order, as I mentioned in the translator's introduction, so that my translation wouldn't become something that somebody found after my life in a box, like the way this book, ended up being, I decided to use the older versions of Newman in the Newman Reader, and actually get the book done.
Yeah, and the Newman Reader uses what's called the Uniform Edition.
Okay.
And so in I think it's 1906 to 1910-ish. I can't remember the exact dates, but Longman Screen and Company reissued all of Newman's text, and those are what we know of today is the Uniform Edition.
Okay.
And so those are that's what we use for the journal for the most part, and they're kind of the main translation, or the main editions that are used. Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So, and then thanks to the work of Danny Michaels, our Chief Technology Officer here at NINS. If you're doing any more work like this in the future, the updated version of the Newman Reader, which is on the horizon, will have a direct link to the digital collections of that particular edition.
Oh, wow.
And then you can search through everything immediately, not just back and forth.
Wow.
So
that's going to be very
the research capabilities are only going to improve.
Terrific.
Yeah.
That'll be a great resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Do we have an estimate of when that might?
I'm not going to promise anything.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry, I
In the
just
works.
wasn't sure where we were in that project. Um, so what are some of the things you learned from this project? You've already told us lots and lots of things, but is there anything unique?
I just learned more about the human side of Newman.
Yeah.
I would times he was sad, frustrated, struggled, the role of friendships in his life, and his just really beautiful commitment to truth. That's
Mhm.
something that Ida Görres highlights, and that I think she really loves about him. Um, and that he's willing to sacrifice because there's something greater than himself.
Mhm.
Um, Also, this section on conscience I found really helpful, and each time I read it, I learn something new. And something that may be of interest to listeners is I created a free study guide for the book by Ida Görres.
Mm.
And it has questions that can be used both for personal reflection. Some individuals who have read the book told me, oh, I found the study guide really helpful to help me absorb each chapter. But it's also designed for classroom or book club use.
Mm.
So there's questions for each chapter. And it's available free at a website I created about her. That's Ida Görres. That's IDAGOERRES.org.
Mhm.
Under books. And I tested it with an online reading group of friends I have, where for several years now we've been reading through works of Görres, often in draft translations of mine.
Oh,
So I was able to do a test drive of the study guide and adjust it based on what actually worked in questions.
that's wonderful. I've actually witnessed this study guide, and um, I'm hoping that we'll be able to use it in one of our study groups or something. Your bio says that you're currently researching the work of, forgive me for mispronouncing.
They're unknown figures, so don't
Okay.
worry.
Augustin Rüssler
Mhm.
and Oda Schneider. So who are they, and what is
Yeah.
their connection?
So Father Augustine Rüssler was a Redemptorist priest who lived in the 19th century to early 20th century. And he led the Catholic interest in Germany on the question of women's roles.
Okay.
And he wrote a huge book, hundreds of pages, on what in the 19th century was called the woman question, according to philosophy, history, and scripture.
Okay.
And so I started a project because the only edition of that book available is in the old Gothic script.
Mm-hmm.
So I have started a project and got funding and hired a young Austrian to convert the entire book to the modern alphabet, to reissue it.
Okay.
And it'll be reissued in 2 volumes because it's so huge, because it's such an interesting witness to Catholic engagement
Mhm.
with these questions. And at least 3 different popes viewed him as like the go-to person on trying to figure these out. And his book is said to have influenced Casti Connubii,
Okay.
the encyclical.
Yeah.
And then Oda Schneider, I'm really excited about. She was a 20th century Catholic author. She was involved in the youth movement. And she was a prominent author on catechesis. She also is, from what I have found so far, she wrote the earliest book that I know of arguing against women's ordination. That was in 1934. And after she was a mother of 5, and after her husband died, she entered Carmel and was a Carmelite nun.
Okay.
And was also just respected as one of the Catholic intellectuals of the era. But her work is entirely unknown, because the direction of the church in Germany today is very different from people like Görres and Oda Schneider. But at the same time, Görres and Schneider were viewed with skepticism by some of their peers who were
Mhm.
more of the bedrock only side of the church.
Sure. Yeah.
So she's quite interesting. So I'm hoping to translate one of her works. And
Wonderful. Well, I'm looking at the clock and we are right at 11 o'clock. So I do want to be conscious of everyone's time. But before we end, I want to thank you for having this beautiful conversation, introducing us to Ida Friederike Görres, who personally I'm going to go buy the book now. I can't wait to get more into her work. She in many ways opens up my eyes to the German context, which, you know, I've kind of lived in the English,
Sure.
Anglo-American English speaking historical context for so long that I kind of forget about the rest of the world sometimes. And the point that you made about Newman being the excitement about the 100 years after Newman's conversion, that's one of the things that I'm going to go research right now. But thank you. Once again, welcome to the Institute. And this has been a wonderful conversation.
well, my thanks to the National Institute for Newman Studies and the work you're doing.
Thank you so much.